Amat merat ike tesolderat igmerut.
In this video, we'll look at the argument in the Meno which involves Socrates arguing that virtue is not knowledge, drawing on the works of people like Scott and Weiss. We will also look at an argument from Julia Driver, who argues that there are certain virtues that rely on ignorance rather than knowledge, as well as a response to Driver from Michael Jeffrey Winter. We'll begin with the argument from Julia Driver, which comes from her book Uneasy Virtue, and is repeated in Winter's paper, Does Moral Virtue Require Knowledge? A response to Julia Driver. As noted in the previous video, Aristotle argues that there is a certain level and kind of knowledge necessary in order to obtain virtue. The argument being that we must have an understanding of the various virtues and how they relate to one another and how they relate to the particular situation we find ourselves in, and an understanding of how to apply them to the particular situation we find ourselves in. Thus, we must have a kind of practical wisdom in order to assess the particular situation properly, and in order to apply virtue in our response to it. Driver argues, however, that in some circumstances we must have a certain level of ignorance about ourselves in order to obtain certain virtues, arguing instead for a consequentialist version of the virtues. Driver argues the Aristotelian account of virtues to be committed to 1. The absence of epistemic defect in virtuous agents, and 2. The presence of a conception of the good under which virtuous agents act. The argument made by Driver is critical of both of these things, arguing that there are virtues that involve ignorance and that acting virtuously does not require having good intentions. We'll begin here with a look at Driver's argument that some moral virtues require a certain level of ignorance in order to achieve the virtue, using the virtue of modesty. Driver argues that modesty could, to some extent, be considered a form of intellectual defect with regards to our estimation of ourselves. A modest person could be understood as someone that has not understood just how much they have achieved, or understood just how good their work is. Winter argues that Driver's argument can be understood as such. Premise 1, if there are virtues that require ignorance, then knowledge is not necessary for virtue. Premise 2, there are virtues that require ignorance. Conclusion, so knowledge is not necessary for virtue. If modesty is a virtue, and modesty is a form of epistemic defect, as Driver argues, then either modesty is not a virtue, or there are virtues where knowledge is not necessary. However, is this the case? Could modesty be considered a form of epistemic defect? Winter argues that premise 2 in Driver's argument is faulty, and not based on a good account of modesty. In his paper, Winter puts forward what he argues is a more solid account of modesty, one that not only captures intuitions about modesty, but also fits with the argument that modesty is a virtue and is still based on knowledge. Winter argues that a good account of modesty involves the following 3 conditions. A. Having genuine accomplishments. B. Being aware of those accomplishments. And C. Having a disposition to refrain from putting forward one's accomplishments. Winter argues that condition A is unlikely to be contested. One can only be modest about things that they have accomplished. If they take credit for something that another person has accomplished, then they're not being modest. They are simply being dishonest. Condition B fits with traditional accounts of modesty. Returning to Aristotle for a moment, Aristotle's account does not give us necessary and sufficient conditions to determine modest from its excess and defect. However, Aristotle does insist that being modest involves truthfulness and awareness about what one has accomplished. Winter argues that C is where his account makes explicit a condition that is generally implicit in traditional accounts of modesty. Winter's account rules out boasting, but does involve a person describing their accomplishments, even if reluctantly if pressed. Winter gives us several different examples of modesty that fit the accounts he gives, and that show that modesty is not based on an epistemic defect. To recount them all is gonna make the video a bit long, so we'll focus on one example that Winter gives us. The example that Winters gives that we will focus on is Bill Gates. Winters quotes Gladwell's Outliers, the Story of Success. Gladwell recounts the various good fortunes and opportunities that were afforded to Gates' early formation, describing Gates' access to a high school that had access to a time-sharing terminal in 1968, that Gates' mother actually had the money to pay the fees, that Gates was lucky enough to know someone that worked at C-Cube, and allowed him to check code at weekends, as well as Gates finding out that ISI needed someone to work on their payroll software, and more. There were a number of lucky opportunities available to Gates in his early years, opportunities available to few, and opportunities that allowed him to get a head start. When asked about these early years, Gates' response was as follows: "If there were 50 in the world, I would be stunned. There was C-Cubed and the payroll stuff we did, then TRW, all those things came together. I had better exposure to software development at a young age than I think anyone did at that period of time, and all because of a lucky series of events." Here we find Gates accepting and acknowledging that there was more to his success than himself and his skills. While it would be wrong to attribute these as the sole factor to Gates' success, it would also be wrong to ignore that these factors played a part in that success. This acknowledgement doesn't minimize the skills and qualities that Gates had that allowed that success to happen either. However, Gates focuses on the good fortune and opportunities that played a big part. Winters argues that this is a good example of what we should consider to be genuine modesty. Many have focused only on their abilities and ignored the opportunities that were afforded to them while boasting about being self-made. A modest person tends not to focus on the elements that allowed them to boast, though. A modest person is honest enough to recognize the importance of lucky breaks and opportunities. As Winter states, this real example of modesty does not seem to rest on ignorance at all. This argument from Winters gives us good reason to reject Driver's argument. While Driver does make a reasonable case, it appears to be based on a misunderstanding of what modesty actually is. Genuine modesty is not a case of having an epistemic defect based on one's abilities and talents, and not understanding just how good we are at a particular activity. Genuine modesty is not a case of denying any of these things either. As Winter shows, genuine modesty is a case of knowing just how much good fortune might play a part in our accomplishments, acknowledging that good fortune and being honest about that good fortune. Genuine modesty, then, is a case of knowledge and a case of honesty, meaning that if modesty is defined as a virtue, then we have good reason to count it as a case of knowledge and to be linked to other virtues such as honesty. Having examined Driver's claim that there are instances where ignorance is necessary for certain virtues and therefore virtue is not knowledge, we will move on to the argument to be found in Plato's Meno. The argument put forward in Plato's Meno is a more complicated argument than Driver's argument, and therefore will require more explanation than Driver's, and is also not as simple to reject. What follows is an attempt to summarize the argument as simply as possible, while drawing on the works of Scott and Weiss. Plato's Meno is a dialogue that involves Socrates and Meno discussing the idea of whether or not virtue is teachable. It begins with Socrates' attempt to get Meno to define what virtue is, and it soon becomes evident that Meno is not up to the task. After several attempts to define virtue, the dialogue moves on to other elements, such as whether or not learning is done through teaching or through recollection, and then through to the idea of whether virtue is knowledge. It is this part of the dialogue that we're interested in here. During this portion of the dialogue, Socrates gives two opposing answers to the question of virtue being knowledge. The first being that virtue is knowledge, and the second being that virtue is not knowledge. What causes Socrates to change his mind? This question will be answered after first exploring the argument from the Meno that virtue is indeed a kind of knowledge. This section of the Meno follows from the discussion between the two main characters about whether or not virtue is teachable. Here Socrates argues that virtue is teachable if and only if it is knowledge. Therefore, the majority of this section is spent arguing for the conclusion that it is knowledge. The argument begins with Socrates arguing that virtue is good, and if virtue is good, then it is beneficial, as all good things are beneficial. We then find Socrates discussing the kinds of things that are usually considered to be beneficial, like health, strength, beauty, and wealth. These things, Socrates argues, benefit us sometimes, but at other times they can harm us. It is only when these things are used correctly that they benefit us. The same with temperance or justice or courage. If any of these things are not some kind of knowledge, then they can harm or benefit us. If courage is not mixed with knowledge of some kind, then it amounts to something like daring. Or, as stated in the previous video, some kind of foolhardiness. Courage is something that lies in the mean between cowardice and foolhardiness. Foolhardiness can cause us harm, while courage is something that comes from understanding of the situation we are confronted by. All of these qualities, Socrates argues, will end in happiness when guided by knowledge, meaning that if virtue is some kind of knowledge, then it can only end in happiness. It is knowledge being something beneficial that leads him to conclude that virtue is some species of knowledge. Socrates then allows for the idea that courage may be considered distinct from knowledge. It is not in and of itself knowledge, but instead coupled with knowledge, and only beneficial when coupled with knowledge. If daring alone is not beneficial, the same could be said for knowledge. If we consider the idea of knowledge without daring, then we can see that knowledge alone may not be sufficient. It might be ineffectual when combined with cowardice, for example. We may know that the right action at that particular moment might be to exhibit courage, but be frozen in fear, meaning that Socrates cannot conclude that virtue is knowledge. It is instead a combination of knowledge and some other psychological qualities. The assumption here is that when Socrates argues that virtue is beneficial to us, he is arguing that on its own it is sufficient to benefit us. Therefore, if knowledge is to be virtue, then it must be sufficient for benefit in and of itself, but this has failed to be shown. Scott argues that Socrates here may be arguing that virtue, either the whole or part of it, is knowledge, meaning that Socrates is arguing that there could be an element of virtue that is not knowledge and not intellectual, but is instead a non-cognitive component, like daring or self-discipline. To show that virtue is teachable in the same way that some other skill of knowledge is teachable, then Socrates has to show that virtue is no more than knowledge. For if virtue is more complicated than knowledge, then it must be acquired in a more complex way. Scott argues that there is a certain asymmetry to the argument here, though. In fact, two. The first is when it is argued that knowledge, when lacking the other assets, may as well harm us as benefit us. If our cowardice gets the better of us, then we cannot say that our knowledge harmed us. It played no part in our actions at all. The second asymmetry, according to Scott, is that knowledge must be there if there is to be any benefit at all. Scott's contention is that this is what Socrates had to say about knowledge. Socrates was never intent on proving that knowledge is sufficient to benefit us, because he was not arguing that virtue is sufficient to benefit us. Knowledge is to be seen as the cause of the benefit, and it must be present wherever benefit is produced, nor can it ever produce the opposite of benefit. The argument, Scott says, should be seen in the sense of the following. It begins with the assumption that virtue is a cause of benefit, not that it alone is sufficient to produce benefit. Knowledge is what produces the benefit in the case of a virtue, and thus virtue is knowledge. Socrates continues to argue for why virtue is a form of knowledge in the dialogue, eventually coming to the conclusion that virtue, being beneficial, and knowledge being the cause of the benefits, means that virtue is knowledge. After concluding that virtue is knowledge, he returns to his original hypothesis that if virtue is knowledge, then it should be teachable. It is here that we see Socrates change his stance from the idea that virtue is knowledge to the idea that virtue is not knowledge. Beginning with the argument that if virtue was teachable, then we should find that there are teachers of it. From here, we see Socrates argue that neither teacher nor pupil of virtue can be found anywhere, establishing by the end that neither the sophists nor the virtuous are teachers of virtue. If there can be found no teacher of virtue and no pupil of virtue, can be found, then we could only come to the conclusion that virtue is not teachable. If virtue is not teachable, then it cannot be knowledge, with Socrates declaring that it is obvious to all that only knowledge can be taught, and if it can be taught, then it is knowledge. After accepting the conclusion of Socrates' arguments, Meno is then led to ask how good men can come about virtue if virtue is not knowledge and virtue is not teachable. Socrates responds by stating that they have overlooked an important distinction, with Socrates arguing that there is more than one way of giving the right guidance. The first is with knowledge, and the second is with true belief. True belief, according to Socrates, can be as useful as knowledge, so long as the person is in possession of true belief. We're then presented with Socrates making an argument that one who gives the right opinion can be as useful as one that gives knowledge, so long as that opinion is true. Socrates gives the example of getting directions to Larissa. If a person is confronted by two people, both giving directions to Larissa, and both give correct directions, then both are as useful as each other. One may have never visited Larissa, but has come to learn from others who may have been speaking about it what those directions are. They cannot be said to know because they have never been there. Well, the other has visited there several times and has used the road several times, so knows the directions are correct. Meno then objects to Socrates' claim that both are useful, arguing that the one that only has an opinion may go right some of the time, but may go wrong at other times. Socrates then argues that the person with right opinion does go right, at least for as long as he holds the true opinion. It is here that we find Socrates offering the distinction between true opinion and knowledge, and why knowledge is more valuable than true opinion. Socrates argues that true opinions are hard to keep hold of. Our opinion may change unless tied down. True opinions are only valuable for as long as the person continues working out the reason for why they are true opinions. It is the effect of tying the true opinions down that they first become knowledge and then become permanent. It is for this reason, Socrates argues, that knowledge is more valuable than true opinion. It is the staying power of knowledge that makes it more valuable than true opinion. Those with knowledge have a firm grasp intellectually on our beliefs and opinion, and this allows us to stand up to challenges. Whereas when we simply hold true opinions, our fallible memories may allow errors to creep in, and therefore surrender those opinions to others that appear to argue better. So, as we can see from this argument, Socrates argues that virtue is not a form of knowledge, but instead a form of opinion. We see him argue that there is a component of knowledge involved in virtue because behaving virtuously is beneficial. If behaving virtuously is beneficial, then it must contain some element of knowledge because only knowledge is beneficial. However, this, at best, can only be opinion. This is because, according to Socrates, knowledge is something that is teachable. As virtue cannot be taught, and there could be no teachers of virtue found, and no one with expertise on the subject, then it cannot be knowledge. This is no reason to think it cannot guide us, of course, because so long as the opinion created by the virtue is one that is true, it, like the guide that has a true opinion about the directions, is as valuable as knowledge. So long as it remains a true opinion, of course, which means that the possessor of the opinion must continue to think about why it is a true opinion.